uncertainty. For the next 45 minutes, I hope I can make the 45 minutes. I will go through it at a probably a rather fast pace, but I'm hoping that you will all be able to understand me both with regards to language as well as concepts that I present. If you do have any questions with regards to understanding, please feel free to also jump in during the talk. Just come up to the stage and start asking if there's any particular thing that you don't understand. If it's more a discussion type question, I would like to ask you to keep that for the discussion at the end, the last 15 minutes of that hour that we have together now. Yeah, so as Alexandra already mentioned, I have made the transition from, let's say, the ivory tower into applied decision making, although you might say I was never really in the ivory tower. Because I did my PhD on shooting decisions at checkpoints in Afghanistan, NATO checkpoints, I must say, not Taliban checkpoints. And my focus has always been a rather applied one. And one of the tools that I find very, very useful, one of the frameworks that I find very, very useful is the one that I would like to present to you today, which is the framework of ecological rationality. And that is basically how do I assess in which decision environment I find myself in? And according to the decision environment in which I find myself in, how do I know which tools to select accordingly? So hence, navigating uncertainty might also already be a hint with regards to how to classify decision environments, and then decision environments and adaptive strategy selection. I hope you enjoy. So what you will find when you open any kind of newspaper these days, or any kind of, McKinsey report, or any kind of Harvard Business Review or whatever, we are kind of being flooded by so many magic bullets these days. There's design thinking, there's agility, there's big data and artificial intelligence, which are sometimes perceived to be just magic wands, which you can just wave over a particular problem of your choosing and it will somehow go away. And what I would like to get across in the next 45 minutes is mostly three things. So three main points. And in the good old tradition of say what you want to say and then say it and then say what you just said, I will now say what I'm going to say, and which is there is no actual magic bullet. There is not that one universal strategy or process for how you will arrive at a good decision. Good decision making is adapted to the decision environment. That's the first major point. The key is differentiating between calculable risk on the one hand and incalculable uncertainty on the other, if you want to navigate decision environments, or if you want to where you are, or what is a good way to differentiate decision environment, then it's between calculable risk and incalculable uncertainty. And the third major point, which I'm hoping I can get across today, and that's actually what we'll be spending most time on, because this is somewhat counterintuitive, is that if you are faced with uncertainty, it's actually this situation where simple strategies can outperform complex strategies. Now, we all have this kind of knee-jerk reflex that if we are faced with complexity and something that we don't understand, that we want to react to with complexity and something that we don't understand. But this is actually not the case. So a lot of research over the last 30 years, and Simply Rational is a spin-off of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development. And our research group, what we did there, we actually investigated decision making in the real world when you cannot always necessarily know all of the alternatives, know all of the probabilities, and attach probabilities to the consequences of your decisions. This is what we call uncertainty. And under these situations, it turns out that simple strategies can actually outperform even the most complex machine learning and AI methods. So the whole thing started with Herbert Simon in the 60s. Herbert Simon is, if you don't know him, I really recommend it to read some of his work. I'm currently reading Administrative Behavior, which he wrote 75 years ago and is still absolutely applicable to understanding organizations today. he really was a powerhouse. He is the only person who both received a Nobel Prize in economics, as well as the Alan Turing Prize, which is basically the Nobel Prize of computer sciences. He founded organizational science, he co-founded cognitive sciences, he co-founded computer sciences. He really was a very, very strong force majeure across a large number of fields. And he is also basically the intellectual godfather of the research group and what we have been researching at the Max Planck Institute. He was looking at bounded rationality, and bounded rationality, especially if you have a background in economics or even behavioral economics, it is always kind of has been interpreted as kind of human decision making and human rationality being bounded by kind of cognitive limitations. And that's why we use, for example, things like heuristics, kind of these simplifying rules of thumb, simply because we don't have enough brain power up there in order to be able to actually optimize our decision process. But this is not the interpretation that Herbert actually meant when he was referring to bounded rationality. What Herbert Simon was referring to was this idea that bounded rationality, that rationality is bounded, or the rationality of a kind of decision strategy cannot just be evaluated in the abstract in a kind of universal form, but it needs to be seen in the context in which a decision strategy is applied. So the rationality of a decision strategy is always bounded to the context in which it is applied. And that's the way that he meant bounded rationality. And he used to have this metaphor, the metaphor of the scissors, in which one blade is the structure of the decision environment, and the other blade is the cognitive ability or the strategy that is used. And only if the two are aligned very well, then you can actually kind of cut the decision problem or cut the task that you are faced with. And moving beyond humans, and we will be moving beyond humans, and also this, especially in business, of course, an actor is not necessarily just a person, but it might also be a team, a business unit, or an entire organization, which has to decide on a strategy in order to deal with a particular decision problem. And now that you might ask, okay, if we're talking about decision strategies need to be adapted to decision environments, then how do I know in which decision environment I find myself in? Because decision environments can, of course, differ along a multitude of dimensions. And one of the things that 30 years of research has basically crystallized is that one of the primary dimensions along which you should differentiate your decision environment is the aforementioned differentiation between calculable risk, in which you know all of the alternatives, the probabilities, and the consequences, and incalculable uncertainty, which is a kind of a reverse definition. You do not know all of the alternatives, the probabilities, and the consequences. And this goes back to Frank Knight, and it's also sometimes called Knightian uncertainty. And Frank Knight lived at the time of the Second Industrial Revolution, at the rise of the so-called robber barons. And Frank Knight was a classical economist. And in economics, you have this thing which is called the optimal price hypothesis or the efficient market hypothesis. And the idea is basically in the efficient market hypothesis that if you have multiple actors competing against each other to deliver a product or a service to the customer, then they will always try to underbid each other in price. So whenever they have kind of like a new technology to deliver the service, or they get more efficient because they have a better processes, in order to be able to get a greater market share, they're going to want to underbid the competition that they have in the market. And that way, you both have a efficiency pressure within or across the competing entities in that particular market, as well as the profits being passed on to the consumer in the form of lower prices. So the idea was that, and that's one of the most fundamental ideas behind, free market economics, why you should let markets reign. is that this double pressure, you do have this efficiency pressure, and the profit is being passed on, and it will end up at the most efficient price that you can actually offer a product, given the technological and other kind of circumstances that prevail. Now, what he actually saw when he looked out the window and kind of not inside his economics textbooks is a very, very different world, which was a world in which there was extreme economic upheaval, extreme social upheaval, and some very, very few actors were actually able to acquire huge amounts of wealth in the very, very, very short span of time. And the efficient market hypothesis or the optimal price hypothesis basically cannot account for this phenomenon. It's because it basically means that you do have these huge windfall profits that you are able to reap. Um, and it doesn't seem to be the mechanisms of the efficient market hypothesis do not seem to be working. If Frank Knight was to live today, he would justifiably ask the question, how is it possible under the conditions of the efficient market hypothesis that a single individual like Bill Gates in a single lifetime can amass a net worth of upwards of 60 billion US dollars? It is not within the framework of the efficient market hypothesis that this is any way conceivable. And for Frank Knight, the reason why both the robber barons and Bill Gates, and I don't want to put Bill Gates in the same room with the robber barons, don't get me wrong here. I believe when you hear a lot of billionaires talking these days, who all kind of seem to want to escape the planet, Bill Gates is kind of looks a bit like the adult in the room. So I don't want to knock him in any sense, but for Frank Knight, this ability to acquire this huge amount of wealth in a free market, so to speak, boils down to this differentiation between risk and uncertainty. Because under risk, basically every one of the market participants knows the optimal solution. And therefore, everybody works towards this optimal solution. And there you can only gain value, or you can only outcompete your competitors by basically increasing your efficiency. But the optimal solution basically can be accessed or has been decided upon by every market participant. Whereas under uncertainty, you can generate very, very, very large profits because you have found an individual solution to a unique problem. And before the other market participants can actually either come up with a similar solution themselves or find out how to copy you, you are able to generate these huge, huge, huge profits. And this is exactly also the kind of situation that we see around us today. New business models, new ways of delivering services that people haven't thought about are actually the ones that generate these huge, huge amounts of wealth. And Frank Knight considered uncertainty management much more than risk management. He considered uncertainty management to be the primary driver of economic value, right? So people really trying to find new solutions to individual unique problems and then providing their insights to the masses, so to speak. And I would like to go through a couple of scenarios with you now, and to just get a feel for like what is risk and what is uncertainty. I gave you the two definitions before. Risk is where you know all of the alternatives, all of the probabilities, and all of the consequences. Uncertainty is where you do not know all of the alternatives, probabilities, and consequences. And I would like to just present you with a couple of scenarios and get a little bit of a feel so you get a little bit of a feel for risk and uncertainty and the differentiation between the two. Now we are now in at the casino table, at the roulette table in a casino. And I would like to just ask you in the audience, maybe just by raise of hand, what you think. Is playing roulette in the casino, is it more a situation of risk or is it more a situation of uncertainty? I could just have a show of hands, please. For those that think it is risk. I think I'm doing more or less fine for time. Does anybody want to come up and say why they think it's risk? since we already have that opportunity here in Gathertown. Yes, Augustin, go for it.
Guess all the probabilities and the costs for the events related to those probabilities are known in roulette. I think it doesn't depend on what the other person is betting on, where you don't have any influence on. So that's why I thought it's risk. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would agree. It is a situation where kind of if I go into if I go to the casino table, to the roulette table with 10,000 euros, I can calculate with a kind of with a kind of standard uh, uh, um, with a probability spread, I can calculate how long it's going to take until I lose everything, right? Because that's why you have the green zero at the roulette table, because in the long run, the bank is always going to win because of the green zero. You can't bet on the green zero. But yeah, you can actually precisely calculate how long it's going to probabilistically take you to lose everything. Second situation, the time of death. Who thinks that this is a situation of calculable risk? Please raise your hands. No, not many. Not many think it's calculable risk. Anybody like to come up and say something about it? Yeah, Sanian?
Yeah, so I'll probably be wrong, but I suppose we cannot live past a certain age, which is pretty sure. But we cannot know exactly at which moment we're going to die. We could die at
Mhm.
one, or we could die at 150, but we can be pretty sure that no one is going to live past 200 years. So,
Mhm.
just like their insurance do, they calculate the risk and of living or dying at a certain age, and then they can give you life insurance. I would say the calculated risk.
Mhm. Okay. So with enough data, etc., and given the economic model, yeah, or given the mortality tables and stuff. Mhm. So actually, so for this, and this is also a theme that is going to go through this, to identify where you are on the risk uncertainty spectrum, it's actually important to know which perspective you have. So for this particular problem, if I take the individual perspective of my individual time of death, then it's more in the realm of uncertainty. I mean, I can go jogging every day, I can eat healthily, and I can increase my lifespan or the probability that I'm going to live a long life. And I also have a kind of like a bound on the maximum lifespan I can probably have. Although there are some people that postulate that there's something like a mortality escape velocity, and that some people that are born today are already living in a time where, when you consider age as a disease, which can be treated at some point, are not going to be dying anymore, where the ability to rejuvenate yourself is going to outpace your aging process basically at some point. But putting that aside, let's say we do have a maximum on our lifespan, and that's, yeah, so that's probably going to be the case. But I can eat very healthily and go jogging every morning, and then slip out on the ice, and then smash my head on the pavement, and then I'll be dead. So that's the accidental part of my time of death, is always going to be something that is going to be uncertain. um, Now, if I take the perspective of a life insurance company, for example, then it's a very different situation, because life insurance companies, the mathematical models that they have, and the mortality tables and the other kind of information on the risk profile of their customers, these models are actually so sophisticated that they are very, very good at saying, okay, out of a cohort of 1,000 people with so and so many side effect risk profile of kind of like chronic diseases or age or gender or other kind of information that they use to calculate this, we can expect that so and so many plus minus will die within the next 12 months, right? Um, Now, from the perspective of the life insurance company, this is actually a risk situation. And this is one of the reasons also Frank Knight divided markets into risk markets and uncertain markets. And this life insurance market, as we have it today, in most countries, is actually something that Frank Knight would refer to as a risk market, because the formulas that are used to calculate probability of death within a cohort or frequency of death, as well as the data, the mortality tables, and so on and so forth, they are available to all of the market participants, so that the way that market participants can actually out compete each other is only by increasing efficiency, for example, like digitalization or things like that. And that's why the life insurance market, for example, is relatively stagnant. There is not life insurance startups popping out all over the place, because the solution is actually known to all of the market participants in this market, right? And that's why they only can generate value not by really having truly novel solutions, but by enhancing their efficiency, right? So this would be a classical risk market in Frank Knight's terminology. Complex production processes, for example, in car manufacturing, do you think that's more a situation of risk or a situation of uncertainty? Let's hear it. Let's give the hands to maybe mix it up a little bit. Who thinks that it's uncertainty, complex production processes? Mhm. Would anybody like to? How many? I can only see actually very few hands because I cannot see the whole room. Are there a lot of hands for uncertainty? No. So most of you on the risk camp. Maybe somebody who thinks it's uncertainty would like to come up and say a few words about it.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
I think it's sort of a process that seems very fertile for inventions
Mhm.
and innovation. And I think a lot of big steps have happened in this field in the past, and it's now out of the questions that big innovations will happen again. Um, I guess
Mhm.
like breakthroughs when it comes to automation and things like that. Um, those seem very hard to predict. Um, and
Mhm.
yeah, the first thing that comes to mind was how Toyota had a very different supply chain, I think, in the 70s that really changed the market.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah,
Mhm.
that's sort of my argument for it.
Yeah. Good. Thank you, Andre. Yeah, so again, here it very much depends on the perspective, right? So, for example, if I look at the line worker, which is actually working at the factory floor, then I have my checklist of steps that I have to work through, and there's not much uncertainty there. If I go to the line manager, if I go up one level within the company, then I do things like quality assurance, quality control, then I still have a lot of data and a very structured process, right? I can say, okay, out of 1,000 tires that we built, so and so many, or like out of 1 million tires that we build into the cars per year, we know that between 30 and 50 are going to have some kind of problem, and then I can try to identify in my production process where most of these errors come from, and then I can try to continue to reduce the error there. But what happens if I go one level up, if I go to the level of supply chain management, and then I think about things like Corona or sanctions or war? Um, then, of course, a lot of uncertainty starts creeping into the picture. And then, if I go even one level higher up and I think about kind of strategic decision making, do I go into electricity? Do I go into what, like fuel cells? Do I go into what? Where am I gonna? Which direction do I want my company and my technology to take? um, then of course you're faced with more and more uncertainty, right? So here again, it's a matter of the perspective that you take, whether you can quantify the risks, probabilities, and alternatives, or whether you are actually faced with unquantifiable uncertainty. So this is just a little bit of a warm-up, so to speak, and differentiating risk and uncertainty. Of course, it's not a purely binary definition that we are faced with here. The world isn't binary. Thank God for that. So nowadays, when we say, okay, a situation where you have a lot of data, where you have simple problems in the sense that you have a very good understanding of the causal structure of the underlying problem, right? It's not like it's a simple problem in that sense, but our understanding of that issue is very, very good. Or you have a very stable environment. That's where you are in a situation of risk. The more you're missing data, the less data you have, the more complex your problem becomes in the sense of you're not having a very good causal model of the problem. And the more dynamic the environment, the more fast-paced it is, especially if your ability to gather data is heavily outpaced by the speed uh, uh, um, uh, 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 with which the world changes, basically, your decision environment changes, the more you're moving into the realm of uncertainty, right? And interestingly enough, as I already foreshadowed, complex problems require complex solutions. That's kind of our knee-jerk a reaction when we are faced with complexity or uncertainty, to say, oh, like for example, the Basel criteria for financial market regulation. We're certainly currently at the third iteration. The first iteration had 30 pages. The second iteration had 300 pages, and the third iteration had 700 pages. And I'm pretty sure it's not going to save us from the next financial meltdown. But we do have, as humans, we have this gut instinct that if there is some uncertainty that we are faced with, we need a very complex solution to counteract this. And for the rest of the talk, I'll be giving you actually examples how this is not necessarily the case. And I will start with a very, very simple example. How to catch a ball. Like, has anybody here ever caught a ball before? Can I have a show of hands who ever caught a ball in their life? Okay, so I'm the only one that's never caught a ball. All right, I tried, but I haven't so far. More of a body sports than ball sports person, I guess. But yeah, so there's different ways to go about it. For a long time, maybe if you introspect now for a little bit, how is it that you do catch a ball? Think about it for a second. And now I'll move to the next slide. For a very, very long time, it was considered that the brain does something like a trajectory calculation. So this is, for example, what Richard Dawkins, a very famous evolutionary biologist, once said, that at some subconscious level, the human mind, when it wants to catch a ball, does something, or like not just the human, but generally the animal mind, if it wants to catch an object, does something along the lines of this kind of differential equation of parabola calculation, right? And this is how such an equation looks like. Not sure about you, but my brain certainly doesn't do this. I mean, this is quite complicated stuff, and this is actually a simplified version of the calculation of the actual equation. It doesn't, for example, include changes in wind. It doesn't include spin, and so on and so forth, right? So this is actually a very, very impoverished kind of equation when you want to catch a ball. There is an alternative that I feel more at home with, I must say. Oh yeah, this is the quote by Richard Dawkins. When a man throws a ball high in the air, he catches it again, he behaves as if he had solved a set of differential equations in predicting the trajectory of the ball. At some subconscious level, something functionally equivalent to the mathematical calculations going on. Now, there is a simple alternative, which is called the gaze heuristic. It's basically fixate on the ball and start running and adjust your running speed so that the angle between the ball and the horizon remains constant. And then you will always end up where the ball lands when the ball lands there. I'll show this. So here we go. So this, you just keep the angle constant. I'll I got the horizon in here as well, so you can make sure. So the angle always stays constant. And the closer you move, as long as the angle stays constant, you will always end up where the ball is when the ball arrives there. If any of you have ever seen baseball, sometimes you see this when somebody hits something that's not quite a home run, but the outfielder really has to run to get it. And then they keep looking at the ball and they're running and they keep looking at the ball. And sometimes they really smack into the audience booths, right? Because they've been looking at the ball the entire time. And animals use this heuristic as well. It's not just humans that use this heuristic. Animals use it as well. If you have a dog, for example, and you throw a frisbee, you'll see the dog running and the dog will look back and the dog will actually follow the curvature of the frisbee as well. So it's not like we're standing around, because these are also different behavioral consequences if we did one thing or the other. If we did the differential equation calculation, we would stand around, calculate, and then we would run and arrive where the ball will land before the ball arrives there. This is not what we see. We see actually people, doing this kind of looking around and adjusting the gaze when they want to catch a ball. Now, why does this work? Why has nature decided that it's going to do this and not the much more complex calculation? And the complexity in the calculation is not in the integration of the information. It's not the fact that you have kind of like a differential equation here which tries to integrate this information. I mean, running, balance, hand-eye coordination, all of these are very, very, very complex processes where the body integrates a lot of internal information at a very, very, very short amount of time. The reason why evolution has provided us with this mechanism rather than with the equation mechanism, and I hope you can see my mouse because I'm hovering over the two different things, is because here you need to actually estimate all of these parameters: the initial speed, the angle of the launch, the friction, the mass of the ball. Okay, acceleration of gravity, that's a constant, but you need to actually extract all of these parameters, and you need to fix these parameters in this model very, very quickly from probably very, very difficult to gather data. Whereas the parameters that I need to extract, the information that I need to extract from the environment in order to be able to use this procedure, is just the angle of the object as compared to the horizon on the retina. And I can very, very robustly and very easily extract this information from the environment. And this is going to be a recurring theme when I talk about why, under uncertainty, simple strategies actually outperform complex strategies, because a lot of times complex strategies are complex because they have a lot of free parameters which they need to integrate in very complex ways. And in order to be able to estimate the parameter values for these free parameters, you use data. And this data needs to be, in this data, you will have a lot of noise, especially the more uncertain the environment, the more dynamic it is. You will have a much, much bigger problem estimating the parameters of your models accurately. And by ignoring information and by simplifying the decision process, you're actually avoiding a lot of what is referred to as the variance component of error. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to predict, right? You're not trying to fit the model to the past. If you're fitting your model to the past, then of course, the more complex the model, the better. The more free parameters, the better, because the past has happened. It's stable, it's constant. But if I want to do prediction in an uncertain, dynamic, fluctuating world, I need to focus on only the most reliable and robust factors and actually ignore the other information. And this is how I arrive at better predictions. And because you do have this problem of estimating parameters, and that gives you a lot of variance error. Your model is basically all over the place. It's very susceptible to dynamics and uncertainty in the environment. And this has been found in various other domains as well, which might also be more close to business activities and business life. So for example, this guy here, Harry Markowitz, he won the Nobel Prize for basically inventing portfolio theory. at the heart of portfolio theory, which is modern investment theory, basically in a nutshell, lies the mean variance model. And the mean variance model is a way to optimally balance more risky and less risky assets in a portfolio to arrive at the optimal return on investment. And for his life's work, Harry Markowitz received the Nobel Prize in 1991, I believe. And as part of the Nobel Prize ceremony, he was interviewed by an interviewer of the Nobel Prize Committee. And he was asked, so what are you going to do with your prize money? Because the Nobel Prize also goes hand in hand with a little bit of prize money. And he was asked, well, you're probably going to use your mean variance method of optimal asset allocation in order to, allocate your assets for your retirement fund. And he said, well, actually, to be totally honest, when I do my own investments, I don't really use the mean variance model. I use a very simple strategy. I just look at a diversified portfolio and I divide everything equally, 1/n. And this kind of infuriated his colleagues because there was this guy standing, having just received the Nobel Prize for this very, very smooth. I mean, this is like if you are a mathematician or mathematically minded, this is not a super complex mathematical model, right? I mean, I'm not a mathematician. I do not understand this. This is a classical econometric model, but it's still definitely far more complex than 1/n. And so his colleagues were rather shocked, right? So how is it that you're not using your own Nobel Prize winning theory in order to do your own investment decisions? And it actually took 20 years after he announced that until we basically had the computing power and the data available to check Harry Markowitz's intuition about whether he should use his own model or whether he should trust his gut and just divide all of his assets equally. That's what De Miguel Galapi and Upal did in 2009. And they looked at 17 different markets, right? And this is really a representative sample. I'm not cherry picking here, I promise. Please go have a look at the original publication. They looked at 13 or 17 different markets. So here we have kind of like the Standard and Poor's index, industry portfolios, international portfolios, some tech markets, FF1, FF4, and so on and so forth. And they wanted to see whether which of the models, if you use 1/n or if you use the mean variance model in prediction, not in data fitting, but both models got data, I believe 10 years of stock data, and then they made their decisions. And of course, 1/n, the number of assets was fixed, so they had two different situations that they looked at: a portfolio of 25 assets and a portfolio of 50 assets. And this is the results that I show you is for 25, but don't really differ between whether it's 25 or 50. But they found that actually the 1/n strategy, when it wants to predict, and this here you see Sharpe ratio, which is one kind of measure of return on investment, it outperforms almost across the board. It outperforms the complex mean variance portfolio prediction because there's so much noise, so much dynamism in the stock market that the important thing for investment is actually to keep it simple, right? Very, very rarely it outperformed the 1/n. The mean variance portfolio outperformed the 1/n, for example, in the FF4 factor market by a very little bit. Overall, 1/n drastically outperformed the mean variance prediction. The Miguel Galapi and Upal also calculated how long or how much stock data the mean variance model needs in order to estimate its parameters accurately enough to make better predictions than 1/n. They arrived at 500 years. And even today, bank consultants, when they go around, sometimes you see advertisement for things like, oh, have you ever heard of Harry Markowitz? Oh, no? Well, he invented portfolio theory. And if you haven't heard of him, then it probably means that you can optimize your portfolio. Now, if a bank consultant or a kind of investment guru ever approaches you with something like that, you can tell them to come back in 500 years when the mean variance portfolio has gathered enough data. So that's the lesson to be learned here. I'll also give you another example. Is one problem or one important decision that has to be made is to estimate whether past customers will still likely buy from you. This is, for example, very important if you want to plan marketing campaigns. Who am I going to target? How much money am I going to spend for the marketing campaign? Do I have a method how to pre-identify those that are at a very high likelihood of buying my product again? So this is a valuable decision problem that a lot of money is being spent on. And here also colleagues from my research group have looked at various different ways how you can predict customer activity. Now here we have the Pareto non-binomial distribution model from classical or from neoclassical economics, which basically looks at the time of the last purchase, the frequency of the purchase, and one or two other parameters. It integrates these in a complex way, relatively complex way, but it doesn't use that many pieces of information. Nothing compared to a random forest, for example. This is just I don't know if some of you know a random forest. A random forest is basically a modern machine learning method based on a data set, a training data set. The random forest constructs hundreds or sometimes thousands of decision trees, and this is just an example of 3 of those decision trees, the level of complexity that these decision trees can attain. And then when a new object has to be classified, then basically all of the decision trees vote. And if the majority of the decision trees vote, yeah, the customer is still going to be active, then it's the overall model classifies the customer as active. If the majority of the decision trees vote the customer as inactive, the overall model votes the customer as inactive or predicts that the customer is not going to be buying the product again. So that's one of the reasons why it's also called an ensemble model, because it actually distributes the decision across many submodels. And this uses whatever data it can get its hands on. So in the simulations or in the study that we were running here, it had access to I think 48 different parameters when we looked at this. And this was compared to a heuristic, kind of like a manager heuristic in sales, which has been around for a while, which is, well, if the customer hasn't bought anything in the last X month, then he's probably inactive, right? So that's the level of the complexity of the simple heuristic that experienced managers use for predicting customer activity. And the X is the free parameter in this model, right? And the X is actually different from market to market. So for example, in airline, like a cheap airline flight, low budget flights, for example, the X is different from retail, from electronics, from whatever. But generally, like this is so this is the only parameter that has to be estimated from the data, right? That's the only parameter that this model uses in order to make its predictions. Again, here just a representative sample of the various markets that they looked at: coupons, pasta, and clothing. And you can see, okay, the Pareto MBD model, the complex model from economics, is not performing very well. It's actually performing pretty badly. Here it performs a little better even than the random forest, but it never really beats out any of the other models. The hiatus heuristic actually outperforms, both the Pareto MBD model and the random forest model, if only by a margin sometimes, but it actually does outperform these far, far, far more complex models, which use much, much more information. And here in one situation, it's marginally beaten by the random forest, but I think we forgive it there. And that picture is representative of all of the other markets that they looked at as well. So these are very, very counterintuitive and very interesting results if you want to also assess what decision strategy you want to go for, depending on the decision environment that you find yourself in. So if you are in a situation of risk, where you have a lot of data, you have a good understanding of the problem, and you are in a relatively stable world where you can rely on the fact that the data you got yesterday is still going to be predictive of what's going to happen tomorrow or representative of what's going to happen tomorrow, then by all means use complex methods, optimize, try to get the best out of the data that you have, or the most out of the data that you have, right? However, the more you move into the realm of uncertainty, the more you have a dynamic situation, the less you have a really good, robust understanding of the causal interactions in a particular problem area, the more it is important to actually ignore information that might otherwise lead you astray. Because the more information you try to integrate into your decision-making process, the more likely it is that by trying to estimate what is the actual value of what you consider to be an important factor, from that noisy data, it's going to lead you astray in your predictions quite a lot. Now, this has actually in data science been already uncovered. It took a while to get to psychology and decision making, but this is something that's been known in data science since the late 80s, early 90s, and there it goes under the name of the bias variance dilemma. That makes, if you make predictions, that bias isn't just the kind of error that you need to worry about. Bias is kind of systematic deviation from the correct answer, but variance is kind of the scattering around the right answer. In the mean, it's the correct answer. But if none of the predictions actually hit the correct answer, then that's also a problem, right? So this is the variance component of prediction, can be a much, much larger component of the overall error of your predictive model than the bias component of the error. So by all means, use machine learning, use mathematics and statistics, use logic when you are in a situation of risk, or when you're just trying to fit the past. If you're just trying to find out something about the past without making any claims about the future, also go nuts on complexity. If you want to make good decisions under uncertainty, however, then by all means use your intuition, because the intuition and heuristics are usually, they are these very, very simple rules, which, for example, Kahneman and Tversky have shown this, that heuristics lead to bias. And they do. If you are in a situation of risk where you could perform better by being more complex, then a heuristic is always going to be suboptimal. But if you apply heuristics in a situation of uncertainty, then they are very much, then it is very much the case that these heuristics are very, very good at ignoring all of the noise, ignoring all of the things that might lead you astray, and actually are more robust decision strategies than some optimizing process. Try to also improve the use of intuition and heuristics by having smart learning environments. So a good error culture, for example, in an organization is key. But also looking at what kind of feedback that you get, for example, in the medical domain. If I'm a medical practitioner and I run a series of tests at the individual level, I will never find out if it was false positives, right? If the test just falsely said, okay, a person has cancer, for example. And if the follow-up tests are also false positive and I treat the person, then to me individually, it will always seem like I made the right choice. False negatives, however, are easy to discover, because if it's a negative and then later on the person develops symptoms and dies, for example, then I know that I have a false negative. And I will always be able to, at the individual level, only get information about the false negatives and never get information about the false positives. That's why I need randomized controlled trials, for example, where I randomly allocate people to two different conditions. So that's why we have, in many situations in medicine, we have this problem that the subjective, intuitive feeling that you should do more, that you should treat more, test more, is actually it's systematic asymmetry in the way that we receive feedback. So by structuring your learning environment, or by being at least aware of these asymmetries in your learning environment, also allows you to critically assess your own intuition and decide whether you would want to rely on your intuition, or whether you might want to use more complex processes, or ask somebody else who might have more experience or better experience than you. And generally, if you want to make robust decisions, then simplify your decision processes and only rely on the pieces of information that you are very sure are actually robustly indicative of what you want to know. And don't just add new information because you have it. Under uncertainty, it's really key that you try to ignore information rather than to integrate information if you're into your decision process. So that's, for example, why AI works very well when we want to look at radiology, cancer prediction, early stage cancer detection in radiology. I mean, here, cancer develops today not very different from how it developed 100 years ago, right? And a machine, of course, can eat huge amounts of data in the form of, radiology pictures in a very, very short amount of time. And already now AI neural networks have discovered early stages of cancer which we didn't even know existed in kind of radiological data. Of course, there you always have to be careful with data quality and things like that as well. But radiology, for example, is an area where you would expect complex approaches like AI, like machine learning, to actually bear fruit. You would not expect that, and this is also what we see in more complex phenomena, which also have social components, for example, flu prediction. Google Flu was announced with great fanfare and great humdrum, but then quietly buried a couple of years later after the engineers first kind of like by hand tried to fix the parameters and and then the swine flu came around and then the algorithm was confused. And then, MERS came around and then the algorithm was confused because what Google Flu Trends tried to do was from search terms by people in Google try to predict faster than central agencies whether a flu pandemic is spreading. So no, it didn't work. You can use big data in things like astronomy, where you have a very, very stable environment. Big data is used very, very successfully in astronomy to identify, for example, extraterrestrial, not extraterrestrial, extrasolar planets, so exoplanets, right? So you just have some data, and big data, and I mean, huge amounts of data are being collected. And then these are actually being analyzed in the initial phases by AI or by machine learning algorithms. And then, when they honed in on a particular area of interest, then an astronomer is actually going to look at the data. But big data has been extremely successful in astronomy because, well, it's pretty stable out there in the universe. But for example, if you want to predict economic downturn or economic, upturn or downturn, then you might not want to use big data because this is what IBM tried to do in the early 2000s. They analyzed millions and millions and millions of data points to try to predict whether the U.S. economy is going to go up and down. And the result of that huge big data analysis was that it had to do with the size of the heels of women's shoes. That was the best predictor for whether the economy is going down the shitter or not, because the reasoning and the insidious thing is, and this is what we have to be aware, if we are blinded by this new technology, then we just basically adopt it uncritically. Somebody tells us the great wizard big data has now discovered that high yields are predictive of economic downturn. What happens? The IBM consumer psychologist came around and said, oh yeah, that probably has to do with, men still earn most of the money. So in economic hardship, women have to make themselves more noticeable. So they have to wear higher heels, da, da, da. Of course, when they tried to predict the next economic downturn, it didn't work, right? The financial crisis came around and the model didn't work at all, and it has never worked since, because this is a highly dynamic, highly unstable, highly uncertain environment, right? So don't do that. If you have structured environments, for example, games like chess, like Go, if anybody of you like to play StarCraft is also a situation. I mean, it's amazing what AI can do, what Alpha Star can do in StarCraft. It's absolutely mind-blowing, but it's still a stable world with fixed rules. That's why we see these great performance increases in these situations. But we do not have a stable world, for example, in predictive policing, where it's been shown when you want to try to predict reoffenders, that this actually doesn't, the best compass, for example, is a judicial decision support software used in the US to predict whether somebody is going to reoffend after they are released from prison, or if you want to release them on bail. And it's actually being used to support bail decisions. Now, it turns out that actually this doesn't predict any better than a totally unstructured or totally unexperienced layperson on Amazon Turk, right? Based on a profile of the offender on the same data that the Compass has. The problem with Compass is only it's a complex algorithm, and it was a black box because it was also kind of like a corporate secret. And when they tried to reverse engineer from the decisions that Compass had made, tried to reverse engineer the algorithm, they found out that it has actually a very strong racial bias, even though race is not one of the parameters in the model. It's actually the model itself is actually race blind, but because there are things like geolocation, there are things like degree, whether high school or university or whatever. All of these basically end up in a network of information that turns out that they actually discriminated against race, right? But you are actually not able to see it because the algorithm is intransparent, right? And that's why they caught the problem quite a lot later than they should have, basically. So yeah, and also don't do that. So I will wrap it up. I'll say good decision making is strategy selection. And any strategy is only as good as it is adapted to the problem, or rather the decision environment in which the problem is encountered. Always reflect whether a problem is more one of calculable risk or incalculable uncertainty. And under uncertainty, be very careful with data-driven approaches. I know many data-driven approaches, like, for example, you do have readjustment parameters, you do have kind of normalization parameters, and like random forests, for example, are very good at also reducing the variance component of the prediction error and so on and so forth. But if you are in the business of predictive analytics and machine learning, always do a comparative model analysis where you compare different families of machine learning models, as well as maybe some simple models from cognitive science and psychology, these heuristic models, against each other. So always put in a linear regression, because they work surprisingly well still today. Most stuff hasn't gotten much better, especially under uncertainty. Use some heuristic models by all means. If the problem applies, use also stuff like random forest. Random forests are usually very good. Extreme gradient boost is doing pretty good, and so on and so forth. But never forget the simple models, because there will be situations, and not too few, where the simple model is actually going to outperform the much more complex models. And the benefit that you have in terms of transparency, in terms of communicatability, in terms of explainability, and implementability, right? I mean, the kind of simple models that we are talking about here. I've developed one for the Charité University Hospital as a decision support to decide whether a patient should go to the intensive care unit or the normal ward after the operation. You can print that on a laminated pocket card and give it to somebody. So it's basically, if everybody's screaming, oh, we are so bad with digitalization in Germany, well, you can digitalize with laminated pocket cards if you really want, right? Just keep the complexity at the back end and try to also look at simple models when you're doing your analyses. And yeah, I will leave it with this slide because I think this is a good overall slide. Of course, if you do have any questions, I'm pretty sure you already have my contact, but this is my email address. You can contact me anytime if you want literature, for example, or any kind of other exchange. I'm happy to talk, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.